We have all.
You want to speak? Should I?
Could.
You probably.
I'm just wondering if we should give it just a couple more minutes.
Yes.
Yes, let's do that.
You join us online. Welcome to those of you who made it to the work, and congratulations for getting here. This event is jointly convened by the Health-Minded Society and the UCL Anthropocene initiative. So these are initiatives to kind of synergize cross-departmental conversations about exactly the kinds of entanglements that we're going to hear about in this talk, notably of ecologies, political economies, epistemologies, and kind of various kinds and types of beings and things, notably geological and biological ones. So Emmanuelle Roth and Gregg Mitman come to us from the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich, where they're working together as well as with some Liberian and Guinean colleagues on the ERC-funded project, Fragments of the Forest, Hot Zones, Disease Ecologies, and the Changing Landscape of Environment and Health in West Africa. And in the kind of blurb for the event, there's a link to the project description. So I encourage you to go find out more. So Gregg is a pioneering historian of the environment, health, science, and medicine. And many of you probably know about some of his work, but there's so much of it and so diverse, we probably have like no different parts of it, different elements. His most recent book, Empire of Rubber, was published by the New Press in 2021. It explores the history and legacy, political, environmental, economic, etc., of the Firestone company in Liberia. Previous monographs include Breathing Space, history, quite innovative history of asthma in the United States. And he's co-edited collections on various topics, notably future remains, those being kind of remains of the Anthropocene. So I'm sure there's a lot of interest in that in this group, as well as on film, photography, animals, exposure, etc. And some of you might also know him for his documentary films, The Land Beneath Our Feet, 2016, which won numerous awards, and the 2014 film In the Shadow of Ebola. And I have heard that Gregg and Emma, as well as their documentary filmmaker colleague, who is here with us today, are planning to do film as part of this project, which will take up some of the themes from the talk today. And Emma is a postdoctoral fellow at the Rachel Carson Center, working on this project, but also, as I got to know through this visit, working on a book manuscript coming from her PhD research, which is an ethnography of the search for the origins of Ebola, particularly in its bat obsession, and through the practices and experiences of virus hunters, so the vets who are kind of tasked with the work of catching and sampling bats. And I think we're going to hear a little bit about them too today. So very warm welcome, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Noemi, for that kind introduction. Thanks to the Health-Minded Society and Anthropocene as well, projects for inviting us here. Emma and I are going to be doing a kind of tag team. So I'm going to start, and she'll join us in a after the first section of this talk. And hello to all of you that are joining us online. Thank you so much for coming. So as Noemi mentioned, let's see here. This talk is part of a larger ERC-funded project, Fragments of the Forest, Hot Zones, Disease Ecologies, and the Changing Landscape of Health and Environment in West Africa. And it involves a team, a very interdisciplinary team of 3 PhD students, Musa Dono, Chadwick Kerwillen, and John Fayai, as well as Emmanuelle Roth, who's joining us today as a postdoc on this project, in which we are collectively looking at the environmental, political, and social forces that have made as well as knowledge regimes that have made the Upper Ghanaian forests of West Africa into a so-called hotspot of biodiversity, conservation, emerging infectious disease threats, and resource extraction. And our intent in this project is not to reify the hotspot, but really to understand how it came into being, how it has been produced, and the ways in which, as a result, is shaping lives and livelihoods on the ground. Largely in Liberia, some of us are extending it into Guinea, as well as I'm doing some work in Nigeria. So to begin, sorry, I'm just juggling screens here. Faint sounds, high-pitched and squeaky, echo up from a cavernous pit of twisted steel and concrete into which we peer. At twilight's edge, the dry season's intense midday sun has mellowed into a cool orange glow as bats take flight. Moses, a middle-aged Liberian park ranger with a solid frame and a taste for good stories, expresses his anxiousness as we lean just a bit further over the chasm below. One man met his end here already, attempting to salvage steel scraps from the abandoned conveyor shaft. Moses holds in the hands our care and protection, and that of the bats who reside in these fragments of a once prosperous iron ore mine. We stand on the plateau in the southern reach of the Mount Nimba range. High mountain peaks form a 40-kilometer chain of sky islands that capture moisture-laden clouds and tower above the rainforest below. Mists envelope the summits and slopes of this highest mountain range in West Africa, which marks the tri-border region where Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea meet. Below us, rugged rock walls step down to Blue Lake, which you see here. A shoreline signpost warns the trickle of tourists who visit this former mining site turned nature reserve. Swim at your own risk. The plateau where we stand was once subterranean itself, before men and machine whittled down this part of the Nimba mountain range. In 1990, 2 decades of open pit iron ore extraction had ended. Depletion of the main ore body, departure of a major investor and buyer, and disarray brought by the outbreak of Liberia's civil wars left the landscape abandoned, but for the squeaky creatures rustling below. With time, the terraced roads carved to move heavy mining equipment crumbled to form the lake basin. Across the plateau, the highest remaining remnant of Mount Nimba is a pile of low rubble resembling the ruins of an ancient Inca temple. The sculpted vistas and fragmented landscapes of Mount Nimba give us a glimpse of what human, non-human, and inanimate beings can be to each other. High concentrations of endemic species threatened by extinction earned this fragment of the Ghanaian forests of West Africa hotspot status in 2000. It was one of 25, now 36 areas on Earth designated by conservation biologists as a place of critical endangerment in need of protection. Mount Nimba also lies very close to the site where in 2013, the Ebola disease became visible for the first time in West Africa. Ecologists came to posit a correlation between biodiversity loss and disease emergence. In the post-Ebola landscape of pandemic preparedness, Mount Nimba has garnered new attention by virus hunters as a potential hotspot, not only of biodiversity, but of emerging infectious diseases as well. Over the last 60 years, natural scientists, mining engineers, multinational firms, scrappers, and tourists have come to the Mount Nimba region to extract value, both living and inert, from its landscape. As open pit mining yield to a nature reserve, the welfare benefits provided by a mine to its workers shifted to include more diffuse forms of corporate social responsibility that extended care to the non-human world. In Nimba, the interests of mining, conservation, pandemic preparedness, livelihood, and ecotourism converge, collaborate, and collide. Blue Lake lies in the middle of the East Nimba Nature Reserve, where international mining conglomerate ArcelorMittal has been piloting a biodiversity conservation program since 2011. It is one place among many on Earth where the relationships between mining and conservation are intensifying and deepening. From the vantage point of the Peruvian Andes, geographer Timothy Norris sees, quote, hotspots of biodiversity and extractive investment as two sides of the same coin. In Liberia, Peru, Madagascar, and Gabon, among other places, mining and conservation both work to gain control over land and resources in the creation of commodity frontiers. Both depend upon the formalization of territory and the parceling of land, whether a mining concession or protected park, to extract value in capitalism's quest for cheap nature and cheap labor. The synergy of mining and conservation, however, constitute more than a winning bet to assert control over and extract value from nature. Moses insists that many of the bats below us migrate to the pit, however man-made, in the dry season. The underground artifice is the coolest crevice at this altitude. In the Nimba region, rare species can hardly be detached from the abandoned mining equipment, shafts, and adits that are now their home. In Mount Nimba, the living now depend on a landscape sculpted by giant earth movers, dynamite, and the toil of people. Neither political ecology nor multi-species ethnography can fully make sense of the fractured formations that comprise Nimba's geology and life history. With an acknowledgement to the recent geo-turn in the humanities, we ask in this talk, what new social worlds and power relations appear when we extend constituent players beyond the living to include, for example, the Earth's rock strata or the discarded remains of human activities? Capitalism, we argue, fragments nature to make value. Surveys of Mount Nimba separated high-grade iron ore and useful timber from waste rock and worthless trees before mining and logging began. But fragmentation of Mount Nimba for profit also created spaces of endangerment. Habitat destruction threatens the lives of rare endemic species, like the viviparous Nimba toad. On fragmented edges of the forest, new relations among people, viruses, and their animal hosts are thought to give rise to zoonotic diseases like Ebola. These hotspots of endangerment accrue value in an era where market mechanisms, from offsets to ecotourism, are seen by organizations like the World Bank as tools of nature conservation and pandemic preparedness. The hotspot plays a role in many tales of the Anthropocene. In this essay, we attend to a genealogy of the hotspot whose multiple beginnings offer points of entry into the relations between rock, animals, viruses, and capital that constitute Mount Nimba. How Nimba became a hotspot and how, in turn, this designation has altered relations among the living and non-living occupants of the region is a question that guides the journey of a historian, myself, and an anthropologist, Emma, through this fragment of the Upper Ghanaian forests of West Africa. So Emma is going to take us on a journey into rocks.
Rocks. Right. The name Nimba comes from Nimbaton, a Mano expression that means hills on which a young maiden slipped and fell. As we traverse the sculpted grass-covered summit along a razor-thin ridge, the place name seems pretty apt. A unique combination of climate and geology formed the precipitous escarpments of the Nimba Mountains. The Precambrian spine of quartzite, permeated at heights above 1,000 meters with high-grade iron ore, has been showered by tropical rains for several 100 million years. Erosion of the softer granitic gneiss and schist formations laid bare iron-rich rocks and made mining easy. Green iron, the best grade according to Moses, whose color testifies to a chemical reaction between iron and hydroxide, is still really abundant around Blue Lake. In the early 1950s, Scottish geologist Sandy Clark conducted exploratory surveys on the Liberian side of Mount Nimba. The survey found high-grade iron ore exposed on the mountain ridge and lower-grade itabirite accessible downslope. 250 million tons of iron ore, valued at more than $7 billion, lay there. Clark's efforts depended upon the knowledge and labor of people in the neighboring village of Bapa. Among Mano and Pele people who reside in this region, the ability to transform iron ore into tools and weapons had long been revered, and smithing was a closely guarded art. Nimba's iron ore had been essential indeed to the contested territory in the chiefdom wars that raged in the late 19th century along the Upper Guinea coast. In 1955, the Liberian-American-Swedish Minerals Company, LAMCO, a joint venture between the Liberian government, Bethlehem Steel Corporation, and a Swedish syndicate, was formed. The Stockholms and Skilda Bank and the mining conglomerate Gränges were entrusted not only with the mining operation, but, in their words, civic and social responsibility that would result in, and I quote, a project of major importance for the economic and social development of Liberia. Major open pit mining began in 1963. Within a year, men and machines removed between 7.5 and 10 million tons of ore and 100 meters of rock where Blue Lake now sits. In the concession, many things besides rocks were fair game for extraction and capitalization. From the manufactured plateau, Moses points in the direction of a few Piptadenastrum and Lofira, ideal woods for railway sleepers and harbor construction, critical to the movement of iron ore from mountain to sea. But waste rock was also used to fill in low-lying wetlands at the mountain space where miners' camps soon sprouted adjacent to the booming town of Yekepa. With Moses, we also spot some tall sugar plum and yangon trees, whose timber has been used by Liberians for carpentry, furniture, and dugout canoes. As the region became economically attractive, the forest was increasingly fragmented to serve the needs of the company and of its workers. They cut down the trees. This is why the air became so hot down in the valley, Moses complains. Later, in the village of Zolowe, elders speak nostalgically of LAMCO. We convened a meeting with them to evoke memories of the company, but many more interested residents came to recall the old men with their phone as well. From the shaded veranda where we all sit, we can see in the distance Mount Tokade, another Nimba mountain, being eaten away by the machines of a new mining company, ArcelorMittal. The old men look back upon LAMCO, in contrast to ArcelorMittal, with affection. One worker remembers fondly the, and I quote, comfortable housing with 24 electricity, and hospital facilities equipped with trained doctors from Sweden, Germany, the USA, and other parts of the world that LAMCO provided to salaried employees. In Yekepa, a town built by LAMCO, the once modern worker housing, swimming pool, school, guest house, and cinema mark a path where free housing, healthcare, education, entertainment helped fulfill corporate responsibility. The multinational company also built a water purification plant and a piping system that turned the Ya River and its mountainous effluents into safe drinking water for everyone. Sewage was treated, transformed into manure, and distributed to farmers. And so, at a time when few people in West Africa experienced the benefits of the welfare state, LAMCO directed parts of its profits into population care, or a form of population care. But hard-fought struggle, which no one mentions in Bapa, brought such benefits. In the mid-1960s, strikes in Yekepa and the port of Buchanan, organized by the National Mine Workers Association for higher wages, culminated in a July 1966 confrontation between Liberian mine workers, Swedish management, and the Liberian military and police. A Swedish television crew documented police brutality, squalid living conditions, and alleged malnutrition suffered by Liberian LAMCO workers during the strike. The resulting documentary, Black Week in Nimba, sparked a national conversation when it aired on Swedish television in October 1996. The episode indeed critically challenged the moral ideals the Swedish executives proclaimed to govern their operations abroad. Gränges and its CEO, Erik Walderström, denounced the program and issued a 29-point rebuttal. But the public embarrassment resulted in the series of social welfare reforms that retired LAMCO workers now remember and long for. The priority placed on worker health, education, and housing was typical of high modernist ideology and its promises of care. It was a relatively cheap and easy promise to deliver when few environmental regulations at the time inhibited natural resource extraction in countries like Liberia, desperate to attract foreign capital for development. In 1969, Swedish conservationist Kai Lindell, under the auspices of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, urged the creation of a nature reserve in the southern Nimba Range. He lamented the fragmented landscape LAMCO created, where, he wrote, roads cut frightful scars in dense high forest. But fragmentation was a necessary prerequisite in assessing what held value and what was worthless in the eyes of capital. Care, in this instance, was tied to a calculus that weighed the fluctuating value of iron ore, the demands of labor, and profit to be made. And Gregg will come back talk about some non-humans.
One of the 10 largest tropical rainforest ecosystems on Earth, the Ghanaian forests swathe much of equatorial West Africa's coast, from Sierra Leone to the Nigerian-Cameroon border, in a verdant cloak. Standing with Moses at a cornerstone of the East Nimba Nature Reserve, a stone's throw from Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, we gaze over a precipice at a broccoli-like canopy of evergreen forest that spreads along the steep slopes and off into the distance. This is a fragment of the Ghanaian forests of West Africa. Its green smoothness interrupted here and there by a section of a haul road, burnt trees, and patches of farmed land. Farming extended to the hills and valleys beneath Mount Nimba after LAMCO's arrival, in part as a result of the influx of workers. During the war, when LAMCO left, Moses used to accompany his parents during lulls in fighting to the slopes where they cultivated cash crops, bananas, coffee, rubber. He knows every ditch in this reserve where so-called secondary forest has taken over the former farms. As we head back to Blue Lake, Moses draws our attention to a crab shell in a stream. It is a trace of the semi-aquatic otter shrew, one of the many rare species, including the live-bearing Nimba toad, poisonous giant butterfly, and tool-using chimpanzee that make the Mountain Nimba region a prized fragment of the Ghanaian forests. The abrupt relief changes make for a dense variety of microhabitats. Mount Nimba, according to biologists, is an Inselberg, an island in the sky. Its isolation, both climatic and geographic, contribute to the abundance of endemic plant and animal species, a metric of value to conservation biologists in promoting diversity. In the 1990s, as the sounds of cutlasses and guns replaced the roar of earth movers in Mount Nimba, the region was made into a biodiversity hotspot, a new source of value upon which conservation and mining converged. British conservationist Norman Myers appropriated the term hotspot in 1988 to call attention to regions of the globe with high concentrations of endemic species experiencing, quote, extinction spasms, accelerated human-induced species loss due to habitat destruction and fragmentation. Alarmed by the prognosis that planet Earth was entering a new period of mass extinction, Myers and his colleagues deployed the hotspot as a triage strategy. In the era of the sixth extinction, the hotspot was, quote, a silver bullet strategy that touted a simple solution to a complex problem. Concentrate the scarce resources of conservation organizations on areas where preventing further habitat loss would save the largest number of species possible. And you can see here, the Ghanaian forest of West Africa is one of the hotspots that they identified. The designation of the Ghanaian forest as a hotspot was intended to attract the attention of governments and NGOs to protect, police, and care for fragments of this once vast ecosystem through acts of enclosure. In 2003, as peace came to Liberia, the interim government established the East Nimba Nature Reserve as a protected area, where once Liberian military and police forces protected Lamco property and surveilled workers, the hands of the state now protects and monitors a heavily mined peak and the rare and threatened species that still populate this fragmented landscape. Conflicts immediately arose with communities who lived in proximity to the reserve. Saeed Thompson, a farmer, artisanal miner, and former hunter and trapper who took college courses in natural resource management, told us that the East Nimba Nature Reserve was created, in his words, without community consent. In 2010, so-called community forests were established in Nimba, and Thompson was selected as chairman of a co-management committee installed for the reserve. Land rights were formalized, and conservation was to be done according to the community paradigm favored by global actors since the 1980s. Co-management committee members ensure that park patrols do not treat the occasional hunter or the farmer encroaching onto the reserve's buffer zone too harshly. Coexistence of mining, conservation, and local livelihoods depends crucially on the mitigation of conflicts in a fragmented mosaic of discordant land uses. Development of the East Nimba Nature Reserve has occurred under the auspices and with the financial support of ArcelorMittal, a leading steel-producing conglomerate that took over the Lamco concession. In the 21st century, transnational mining firms have become the leading source for conservation funding in much of Africa. ArcelorMittal markets itself as a custodian of Nimba, which has become the company's biodiversity offset in Liberia. The ENNR is a resource commodity that benefits ArcelorMittal in appeasing shareholders and critics attuned to questions of corporate social responsibility. Since completion of an environmental impact assessment in 2010, the mining company has been intermittently funding wildlife surveys and park guards. This is meant to compensate for the environmental harms unleashed by a new wave of mountaintop removal just a few miles away on Mount Tokode. Strange alliances arise when life and non-life meet in the extractive zones of mining and conservation. On the Ghanaian side of Mount Nimba, a toad that gives birth to live young, the only known species in existence to do so, proved decisive in turning a nature reserve into a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1981. The viviparous amphibian inhabits a mere 4 square kilometers of high altitude grasslands above 1,200 meters. Here. The capitalization of iron ore and the Nimba toad collided when the Society des Mines de Fer de Guinée, SMFG, learned that one of the Nimba toad's 3 largest populations lived on Mount Signo Sempere, inside the mining concession secured by the company. So this was the concession that they had gotten, but this is where the toad lived. In a gesture of corporate social responsibility and care, the company removed the mountain from the mine plan as a set-aside, a key argument in the company's communication. Toad and mountain became locked in a relation of codependence. The Nimba toad's endemicity affected the survival of rocks and animals. Entanglements of life and non-life, of toad and mountain, wield power in the growing nexus of conservation and mining. And Emma will take us into the world of viruses.
Viruses then. Precious ore and rare animal species are not the only attractors to the Nimba region. Viruses, which confound the distinction between the animate and the inanimate, also draw attention. They too have come to accrue value out of the fragmented landscape of Mount Nimba. In 2017, ArcelorMittal orchestrated the translocation of bats living in an old mining adit on Mount Nimba. The project was a purported act of care, rendered as a biodiversity offset for the company's plans to extend open-cast mining to a new peak in the region. But in the wake of the 2013-2016 West African Ebola outbreak, the largest recorded epidemic of the fatal disease, precautionary steps seemed warranted. ArcelorMittal's environmental manager had heard that bats could be carriers, that's his words, of Ebola. Would bat translocation pose a risk of a disease spillover? He wondered. A Liberia-based team of PREDICT, a consortium funded by the United States Agency for International Development, happened to be sampling wildlife for viruses in the region. Jim Desmond, a charismatic cowboy virus hunter and director of the PREDICT team, was delighted to offer the team services to help minimize risks posed by the translocation of potentially disease-carrying bats. ArcelorMittal provided the necessary infrastructure to carry out the work. In exchange, virus hunters donned protective suits and helped capture more than 2,000 bats at dusk. Moses came to help. With his colleagues, they placed bats by the handful into cages, stacked the cages in pickup trucks, and took the flying mammals to their new home, a concrete tunnel built by ArcelorMittal near Blue Lake. Before the bats' release, the PREDICT team collected the blood and swabbed the orifices of hundreds of bats in the search for the elusive origins of Ebola. And in a blood sample taken from a greater long-fingered bat, the team detected an RNA fragment of Ebola Zaire virus. It was the first time Ebola Zaire virus was found in a bat in West Africa. Now, habitat fragmentation figures prominently in ecological tales told of the causal drivers that sparked the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. In 2015, the Environmental Foundation for Africa, EFA, a Sierra Leone-based NGO, published a study of the relationship between changing land use, forest fragmentation, bat ecology, and Ebola virus disease. Their investigation included a village in Guinea Forestière, several hundred kilometers west of Nimba, in Guinea, where the outbreak is thought to have originated. Using satellite-based data and mathematical modeling, the NGO found a common pattern in 6 of 7 Ebola outbreaks in Africa. Deforestation that resulted in more isolated patches of forest in a landscape mosaic of forests, farms, and plantations led or seemed to lead to a greater likelihood of an Ebola outbreak. And the group recommended protecting large forest blocks from fragmentation to minimize human-wildlife contact and the risk of zoonotic spillover. Those Ebola risk maps produced by AFA owe their origins to another hotspot concept that has come to dominate growing concerns around pandemics in the Anthropocene. In 2008, a group that included Peter Daszak from the Wildlife Trust, later renamed EcoHealth Alliance, published a letter in Nature that was instrumental in shaping US federal policy on pandemic preparedness. The authors analyzed data from more than 300 emerging infectious disease events that occurred between 1940 and 2004. Approximately 60% of these events they found were associated with zoonoses, the majority of which originated in wildlife. Their conclusion? Low latitude, biodiversity-rich tropical rainforest regions in Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia were the highest risk hotspots for zoonoses and posed the greatest threat to global health. And the next year, USAID launched PREDICT. Over 10 years, the program spent more than $200 million furthering research, strengthening surveillance, and increasing laboratory capacity, all aimed at discovering and detecting zoonotic pathogens at the human-wildlife interface. Now, EcoHealth Alliance, ArcelorMittal's infrastructure of extraction, and global biosecurity concerns are what brought Jim Desmond and his PREDICT team to survey wildlife for viruses in Nimba. 5 years later, meaning now, their finding of a fragment of Ebola Zaire virus has still not been published. But this finding has acquired evidentiary value in environmental critiques that mobilize the concept of the disease hotspots to incriminate different types of land use contributing to deforestation. Mining is one of those land use. Nimba figures prominently, for example, in a recent Reuters report on jump zones, where bad viruses are most likely to spill over into human population as a result of habitat destruction. The webpage in the Reuters report is glossy, replete with large pictures of furry bats, aerial shot videos, infographics, and global heat maps visualizing hotspots of endangerment. The message is clear. As trees are cut to clear roads and job seekers migrate to Nimba, mining eats into backland, and I quote, "Spillover risks was already high when ArcelorMittal took over the mine and has only increased since," the Reuters report claims. Who is to blame for forest fragmentation and, by inference, disease outbreaks is deeply contested among conservation NGOs, mining companies, and local people. This became particularly evident when we interviewed the environmental manager for the mining company SMFG, the one in Guinea-Nimba, who also happened to be chair of the Environmental Foundation of Africa, which published a study I mentioned before. If this theory of fragmentation holds true, or holds, he exclaimed, then of course mining can open a corridor for contact. But so can slash and burn agriculture. Mining companies, NGOs, conservation biologists, and virus hunters each find value in a virus inhabiting a fragment of the Guinean forest, in advancing contested and collaborative visions of land use that greatly affect the futures of human, non-human, and inanimate beings of Mount Nimba. Meanwhile, some scientists are critical of the hullabaloo around the so-called discovery of Ebola virus in a Nimba bat. A bat specialist whom we met at a conference on African small mammals in Namibia, where a fault line ran between virologists and conservationists, reminded us that fragments are no ecology. bits of RNA in themselves tell nothing about the complex interrelations and historical processes through which bats came to inhabit an old mining adit in Mount Nimba, or how a virus, which the mammals may be a reservoir for, came to infect and kill thousands of people across Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. And this last slide is actually that of a picture of the artificial adit that was built by ArcelorMittal for the bat translocation. Should I? All right, I'm moving on to the conclusion. In a snippet of Ebola Zaire virus taken from a Nimba long-fingered bat that lived in an abandoned mining adit in a fragment of the Guinean forests, the scales and histories of the hotspot converge. Hotspots, we argue, depend upon fragments. Fragments are, by definition, parts broken off, detached, incomplete. The uneven edges of fragments attract unlikely gatherings. Fragments remind us of that which once was. For some, they become nostalgia and beg repair. For others, they signal new futures, inviting salvage and reuse. Fragments create value. In Nimba, codependencies, trade-offs, and quests for profit bind together bats, toads, trees, lateritic rocks, and viruses. As private businesses and the state embrace revised social and civic responsibilities, modes of care morphed from paternalistic provision of worker welfare to neoliberal care of the more than human. The hotspot reworks strata of causality, responsibility, and duty into modes of governance. These are by no means exclusive. They overlap or fracture in relation to different arrangements of life and non-life. But capital demands difference, and difference demands fragmentation. Mount Nimba has been fragmented into pieces of worth, iron ore and timber, rare toads and viruses, in the ever-changing production and extraction of value from nature. Fragmentation, dissolution, and cataclysmic breaks are something of a motif in the Anthropocene. Fragments call for management and care. We hold that their governance, replete with promises and hopes of repair and restoration, is both the epitome and a litmus test for late extractive industries. In these fragmented landscapes, unexpected and tenuous alliances emerge among rocks, plants, animals, viruses, and people. Past relations are severed, new bonds are forged, and uneasy compromises are found in the disarray and order that cycles of capitalist extraction unleash and seek to impose. But Moses is confident that the forest will once again become whole. It doesn't, or where? Yes, sort of. As we hike up the Sika Valley beneath Blue Lake, where each rainy season has brought its lot of fragmented rocks, rusty steel rods, and concrete pieces, he directs my attention to the two forest blocks separated by the riverbed. He smiles. Look, they're coming together. Thank you very much for your attention.